In 1839, on the edge of a Tennessee valley, two sisters were born who should have been embraced with love. Instead, their identical afflictions condemned them. To their parents, they were fragile daughters. To their neighbors, they were an omen. And to history, they became a tale whispered only in fear. The Abernathy twins, a bloodline science could not explain, and a tragedy the world refused to remember. This is not a story of monsters. It is a story of children who longed to be accepted, yet were abandoned by the world around them. Clara and Margaret Abernathy were twin sisters bound by love, cursed by ignorance, and remembered only through fragments of rumour. Tonight, we unearth their forgotten lives, where faith clashed with fear, where deformity was mistaken for evil, and where innocence was swallowed by superstition. Before we begin, subscribe to the Macabre Record to ensure you never miss another forbidden tale. And in the comments, tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? The story begins not with triumph, but with silence. Silence heavy enough to crawl beneath the skin. The Abernathy estate, a brick and timber house perched above the Cumberland River, stood half hidden among skeletal trees. In the autumn of 1839, it was a home draped in wealth, but smothered by whispers. Travellers rarely passed its gates, and those who did spoke of the land with lowered voices. There was something in the air around the property, something that pressed against the lungs, as if the soil itself was reluctant to be disturbed. It was in this house that the twins, Clara and Margaret, entered the world. But their story does not begin with their cries. It begins with the way the valley reacted before they even took their first breaths. That October had been unseasonably still. The wind used to stir the trees, and nights grew so silent that neighbors claimed they could hear the river itself moving over stone. People in town muttered that it felt as though nature was holding its breath. And then, as word spread that two daughters had been born to the Abernathy line, the silence was replaced by gossip that never faded. Twins were already viewed with unease in the Tennessee countryside. One child was a blessing, but two, especially identical daughters, inspired superstition. Old folk beliefs whispered that twins were one soul split in two, and that to divide what God intended as whole was to invite tragedy. But in the case of the Abernathys, the unease grew sharper still. For these children, though alike in every visible way, bore features the neighbours struggled to name without shuddering. When the first visitors saw them bundled in white cloth, they whispered afterward of how their faces seemed off, as though nature had repeated its error twice. Their skulls rose higher at the brow than was natural, their eyes not quite aligned, their small bodies bending subtly, as if the spine resisted straightening. It was not monstrous. It was not grotesque. But it was enough. Enough for people to glance too long, to shift uneasily, to wonder if God himself had meant for them to survive. The family's servants spread the tale faster than the parents could contain it. A maid whispered to a neighbour that the infants had not cried when born. Another swore that when the midwife lifted one of the twins, the other's hand twitched in perfect imitation. Whether these stories were true or twisted in the retelling mattered little. Once the valley decided the Abernathy daughters were unnatural, truth no longer had any place in the story. Their parents reacted as many do when confronted with both love and shame. Their mother, pale from the ordeal, pressed the children close to her breast and refused to hear a word against them. She saw only her daughters, fragile, vulnerable, and hers. Their father, however, felt the weight of the whispers like chains. In town he caught the stares. On Sundays he saw how the preacher's eyes lingered on him with silent judgment. And at night, when he walked the halls of the estate, he avoided peering into the cradle for fear of confirming what everyone else already suspected, that something had gone wrong in his bloodline. But no matter how much they wished to keep the matter quiet, gossip clung to the family. In an era where science had few explanations for deformities or rare births, ignorance filled the gaps. The valley did not see two infants who needed protection. They saw a warning, and warnings in the 19th century often ended in tragedy. And so, from the moment Clara and Margaret Abernathy were born, their lives did not belong to themselves. They belonged to whispers, to suspicion, to fear. The girls' story, like the house that sheltered them, would always stand at the edge of shadow, a tale that would grow darker with every passing year. The night of their birth lingered in memory like a scar. The Abernathy house was lit from every window, an unusual sight in the sparsely settled valley, where candles were costly and lamps were seldom left to burn. Servants darted in and out, whispers flying faster than the rain that pressed against the shutters. The midwife, a stout woman from a neighbouring farm, was already pale before the ordeal began. She had delivered dozens of children, but the thought of twins, of two lives emerging at once, made her lips tremble with silent prayers. When Clara and Margaret came into the world, the silence struck again. Not the hush of awe, but a silence so heavy it frightened those present. For the girls did not scream, not at first. Their small lungs filled, but no sound emerged. Their mother, exhausted, lifted her head from the sweat-soaked pillow, panicked at the quiet. The midwife rubbed their tiny backs, waiting, urging, begging for that natural cry. It came, but it came from both at once, the sound sharp and piercing, perfectly matched, as though two mouths belonged to one throat. The servants shuddered. The midwife crossed herself. The twins were not grotesque. They were not malformed in a way that made onlookers recoil. But they were different, undeniably different. And in a time when difference was feared more than understood, that was enough to plant suspicion. Both girls bore elongated brows, the bones of their skulls rising higher than the midwife had ever seen. Their eyes, though bright, seemed unaligned, each pair gazing just off-center, never quite meeting another's gaze directly. Their small bodies, still wet with birth, curved faintly, as if the spine was resisting its natural line. What disturbed onlookers most was not these features alone, but the way the sisters mirrored each other. When one clenched a fist, the other's hand folded too. When one shifted her head, the other followed. The midwife whispered that it was normal, that twins often shared habits. Yet the servants could not shake the image. Two infants moving like reflections, as though bound by one thought. Their mother, pale but resolute, pulled them close. To her, they were daughters, fragile and breathing, and that was enough. She ignored the way the servants avoided the cradle, ignored her husband's rigid posture at the foot of the bed. But in her heart, she felt the truth that would haunt her until the end. These children were not going to be accepted. Not by the valley. Perhaps not even by their father. The midwife left the estate before dawn. She wrapped her shawl tight and refused the coin pressed into her hand. Later, when asked, she would only say that the girls were unlike any she had seen. She would not elaborate. That silence, though, spoke louder than detail, and by the week's end, the neighbours were whispering. Twins were rare. Twins with identical peculiarities, rarer still. To the valley folk, who filled gaps in knowledge with superstition, the meaning was obvious. God had not made a mistake once. He had made it twice. It was not nature, but judgment. The Abernathys were paying for something unseen. The father tried to smother the rumours. He dismissed half the household staff within a month, claiming expense, though all knew it was fear of loose tongues. Yet the dismissed servants carried the story into the village. They told of infants who never closed their eyes at the same time, who hummed softly in their sleep as if speaking to one another. They whispered that the mother, too weak to leave her bed, clutched the children as though warding off something unseen. In town, gossip wrapped around fact until no one could distinguish the two. A farmer swore he had seen the house lit as though on fire the night the twins were born. Another claimed the river ran strangely high that week, a sign of bad luck. The preacher, when pressed, refused to speak of the matter at all, which only made the whispers louder. And so, even before Clara and Margaret had opened their eyes to the world beyond their cradle, they were already condemned. To their mother, they were blessings. To their father, they were burdens. And to the valley that spread the tale like wildfire, they were a warning. Two children carrying one shadow, a shadow that science could not name, and faith dared not touch. From their first breath, the Abernathy twins were no longer merely daughters. They were the beginning of a story the town swore it would never forget, even as history itself tried to bury it. In the early months of Clara and Margaret's lives, the Abernathy estate grew quieter than ever. Curtains were drawn, visits grew rare, and the parents ventured into town less and less. Yet no wall was thick enough to keep out whispers, and the valley's curiosity fed itself on the smallest scraps of rumour. The twins thrived at first, despite the worry shadowing their home. They grew steadily, their mother nursing them with tireless devotion, rocking them together in her arms. Yet what should have been seen as ordinary quirks of infancy was soon recast as signs of something darker. Servants who lingered near the nursery returned with stories, and those stories gained weight with every retelling. They said the twins rarely cried separately. If one whimpered, the other's eyes welled at once, as though their bodies shared one current of pain. They were not like other infants, who shifted restlessly in their cradles. Clara and Margaret would often turn their heads at the same instant, fixing their unfocused gaze in the same direction, as if watching something invisible move through the room. At night, the sound of their rest unsettled even the most practical ears. Instead of restless murmurs or scattered cries, the girls would hum. A low, droning hum that rose and fell in unison, soft enough to be mistaken for the wind against the windows, yet unmistakable once one stood at their door. Their mother insisted it was nothing, just babies comforting themselves, a sound mistaken for something strange. But to the maids who crossed themselves at the nursery door, it was a chant, a prayer in a tongue no one taught them. The church was slow to baptize the girls. In the 1830s, baptism was often performed within weeks of birth. Yet as months passed, the Abernathy twins remained unchristened. Some said the preacher refused outright, though the family claimed illness delayed the matter. The truth was less dramatic but more telling. When the girls were finally brought to the church in their white gowns, the congregation could not hide its unease. The symmetry of their deformities, the identical arch of their brows, the same faint crookedness of their spines, made them appear less like sisters and more like reflections. Their mirrored eyes drifted across the pews, never quite settling, and mothers clutched their children close. The preacher dipped his hand in the water, but his voice faltered. For a moment the church fell silent, all eyes on the twins who sat motionless in their mother's arms. Finally the words were spoken, but the act did little to silence the doubts of the valley. If anything, it gave them fuel. "Baptized they may be," a farmer muttered afterward, "but God don't claim everything baptized." In their first year, the twins became an object of fascination for the wrong reasons. Visitors who caught glimpses of them spoke of the eerie bond that tied them together. If one reached for a toy, the other's hand stretched too. If one startled awake, the other's eyes flew open. Such behaviors, innocent in themselves, became evidence in the valley's ledger of fear. It was said they were not two lives, but one soul forced into two bodies, a division that no good could come from. Inside the estate, the atmosphere grew strained. The mother clung to her daughters, shielding them from cruel eyes, yet even she could not ignore the unease in her husband's voice. He began to avoid the nursery, spending longer hours in town, his steps heavy when he returned. In whispers meant for no one, he asked whether both girls were meant to survive. Some servants swore they overheard him mutter that one was enough, that perhaps God had intended one child and man's pride had stolen another. The grandmother, A frail woman with European roots recalled old tales she had heard in her youth. She told her daughter softly of legends in the old country, of twins born under the wrong stars, of sister shadows who were said to live one life between two. Her words were not meant to wound, but they weighed heavily. To the mother, they were nonsense. To the father, they sounded like prophecy. By the end of their infancy, Clara and Margaret were not seen as children at all, but as omens. Their lives, barely begun, were already framed by superstition. Each breath they drew, each mirrored twitch of their tiny hands, was measured against a world eager to prove them cursed. The valley did not see innocence. It saw a warning. And the girls, though too young to understand, were already trapped in a story written by others. By the time Clara and Margaret reached the age when most children toddled into the world with curiosity, they had already learned that the world was not curious about them. It was afraid. Inside the walls of the Abernathy estate, they were children like any other. They laughed when their mother tickled their bellies. They babbled nonsense words that tumbled from their lips like a secret language, and they reached for toys with greedy little hands. Yet even in the safety of their nursery, their bond separated them from others. The sisters moved together, always together, as though invisible strings pulled them in the same direction. If Clara toppled onto her knees, Margaret too would lose balance and follow her to the floor, their laughter rising in eerie harmony. If Margaret reached for a rattle, Clara's hand would mirror the gesture, as if both felt the same impulse. Their mother adored it. She saw in their bond something beautiful, a closeness that other siblings could only envy. To her, their mirrored movements were not strange. They were proof of love, proof that her daughters were inseparable, a gift given to her in double measure. But she was alone in this view. To servants who caught glimpses of the children playing, the sight was unnatural. They whispered that the twins did not act as two, but as one, and in that whisper was the beginning of fear, hardening into certainty. When the girls were first carried into the village at the age of 2, wrapped in identical shawls, the reaction was immediate. Women turned their faces away, pulling their own children behind their skirts. A boy shouted a cruel rhyme about witch sisters before being dragged off by his father. Even those who said nothing could not disguise the way their eyes lingered, wide with unease, on the twins' mirrored postures. The church, too, felt their presence. On Sundays, when the Abernathy family appeared, the pews around them grew strangely empty. Congregants excused themselves, claiming illness, but it was no secret why they kept their distance. The twins sat quietly through the sermons, their small hands clasped together, their heads tilting in the same rhythm when the preacher spoke of sin and judgment. And though they never caused a disruption, some swore they felt the air grow heavier when the sisters entered, as if their very presence bent the sacred order of the place. At home, the girls' bond deepened. They resisted separation at every turn. If their father tried to lift one from her chair, the other would scream until she was brought close again. If one was led to a different room, her cries became frantic, animalistic, until her sister was returned to her side. Their mother defended them fiercely. "They are frightened without one another," she said. But her husband grew weary. He saw weakness, something unholy in the way his daughters clung so tightly, as though they could not live unless bound together. The grandmother's tales fed the fire. She recalled to her son-in-law the stories of sister shadows told in her youth, children who were said to have been born with one spirit split between them. Such children, she claimed, never prospered. They brought ruin to their homes not by choice but by nature. Whether she meant to warn him or simply to explain, the effect was the same. The father began to withdraw even further from his daughters, leaving their care almost entirely to his wife. Clara and Margaret noticed. Children always do. Though too young to understand the reasons, they sensed the coldness in their father's eyes, the way he left rooms when they entered. And so they clung harder to their mother, their hands tightening in hers, their bodies pressed against her skirts whenever she moved through the house. To them, she was safety. the only barrier between them and a world that had already begun to push them away. Outside the estate, the valley grew crueler. Children repeated the whispers they heard at home, taunting the twins whenever the family's carriage passed. Some swore the sisters spoke to each other in silence, trading words no one else could hear. Others claimed that animals grew restless when the girls approached, that dogs barked without cause, and horses refused the twins' touch. None of it was proven, but in a community starved for certainty, rumour became truth, and truth became legend. By the time Clara and Margaret were 5 years old, they were no longer welcome beyond their gates. Playmates were denied to them, invitations withheld. The world had decided what they were: omens, curses, an accident of nature too perfect in its imperfection to be explained. And so the sisters retreated further into themselves, finding in each other the companionship the world refused them. Their bond was not a choice. It was survival. For if the world had already decided they were two shadows of one soul, then it was safer, perhaps even necessary, to remain as one. The first true misfortune came in the spring of 1844, when the Abernathy's prized milk cow was found dead in its pen. There was no wound, no sign of illness, no reason at all for a beast that had fed the family for years to simply collapse. Yet by sunrise, the valley had its explanation. The sisters looked at it, a neighbour muttered, and its life gave out. No one knew if the twins had even been near the animal, but proof was never required. In a community that already believed, suspicion was all the evidence needed. Soon after came the barn fire. A stray ember from a servant's pipe had fallen into the hay, but this truth mattered little once flames rose against the night sky. Villagers stood along the ridge, watching orange light pulse from the Abernathy land, and by dawn, the tale had already changed. Some swore they saw the twins standing at a window, their small faces illuminated by the fire, smiling as though they had willed the destruction themselves. Others claimed they had heard voices, high, eerie voices singing from within the smoke. Whether those who claimed it truly believed or simply wanted to, the result was the same. The twins were blamed. Tragedy breeds rumour, and rumour thrives when fear already lives in the heart. A stillbirth struck one family, and within hours, whispers tied it to the Abernathy children. "The twins passed by my door," the grieving mother said, her voice thick with rage, "and by nightfall, my child was gone." A farmhand's sudden illness was explained the same way. A horse's broken leg, a blight on a patch of corn, even a quarrel that ended in fists, all found their way back to Clara and Margaret. The cruelest part was that the girls were old enough now to sense it. They were not yet 6, but children notice the world even when adults think them blind. They saw the way neighbours crossed the street rather than meet their eyes. They felt the mocking stares of boys who shouted cruel names as they passed. And though they could not understand the words whispered about them, they felt the weight of those words pressing like stones. Their mother defended them with all the strength she had. She scolded the servants for gossip, forbade them to speak the girls' names outside the estate, and kept her daughters close at all times. Yet her efforts only deepened suspicion. A mother who clung so fiercely to her unnatural children must be hiding something. Her love, fierce and desperate, became one more piece of evidence against them. The father, meanwhile, grew quieter. His pride, once the armour of the family, had eroded under the constant gaze of the valley. At the tavern, men whispered as he entered, their silence louder than speech. On Sundays, he felt the pews around his family grow emptier, until the Abernathys sat alone like lepers. Every look told him the same truth. He was no longer respected. He was pitied, even feared, and it was because of the 2 girls who bore his name. Inside the estate, the tension thickened. The father drank more, his voice sharp when the twins clung too close. He began to avoid meals when they sat at the table, muttering excuses and leaving his plate untouched. His absence was not lost on the girls. They turned their faces toward their mother, but the shadow of rejection lay heavy, shaping their young hearts. The cruelty of the valley sharpened into open hostility. On one occasion, when the family carriage rattled through town, a boy hurled a stone at the wheels. It missed, clattering harmlessly to the dirt, but the laughter that followed cut deeper than any wound. Clara and Margaret pressed their faces to each other, trembling, while their mother hissed for the driver to hurry. Their father, sitting stiff beside her, said nothing at all. It was during these years that the twins began to fold further inward. They played only with each other, inventing games no one else could join. They whispered to one another in a secret language of half-formed words and mirrored gestures. To them it was comfort. To outsiders, it was proof that they conspired in silence. The valley already believed them cursed. Now it began to see them as dangerous. By the time they turned 7, Clara and Margaret had become the valley's scapegoats. Every illness, every accident, every sorrow found its way to their names. No matter how far they stayed behind the gates of the estate, the world pressed in, ready to assign guilt. For the twins, childhood had ended before it truly began. Their innocence was stolen, not by what they were, but by what the valley chose to see. The Abernathy estate was no longer a home of laughter, but of whispers and closed doors. The twins, now entering their 8th year, had never known what it was to feel safe beyond their mother's arms. She remained their fortress, holding them close, wiping away their tears, telling them softly that they were loved. But her strength was waning. Years of childbirth, stress, and the relentless burden of defending her daughters had taken their toll. The once bright woman who had filled the estate with music and warmth grew pale and hollow-eyed. Her steps faltered on the stairs, and she spent long hours in bed, her hands trembling when she stroked her daughter's hair. Clara and Margaret clung to her with desperation, sensing that she was slipping from them. They whispered to her in their secret language, promising in broken words that they would never leave her side. Their father, however, walked a different path. He had once carried pride in his shoulders, the weight of a family name that meant something in the valley. But as gossip grew, as neighbors turned their backs, that pride curdled into bitterness. To him, the twins were no longer children. They were a curse carved into his bloodline, a mark that robbed him of respect and left him a husk of the man he had been. He drank more heavily, his hands shaking when he poured, his voice harsh when it rose. He avoided the nursery entirely, leaving the care of his daughters to his wife and the few remaining servants who dared to stay. When the girls reached for him, he stiffened. When they called his name, he left the room. And when their mother begged him to show kindness, he answered only with silence, or worse, muttered words about sins, about punishment, about God's will. The valley noticed. Neighbors spoke of how the once proud master of the Abernathy land now kept to himself, his clothes unkempt, his eyes bloodshot. Some pitied him. Others said it was proof that the curse of the twins was eating him alive. In either case, the girls became less human in their neighbors' eyes with each passing season. They were no longer merely children who looked different. They were a living plague that consumed their father and weakened their mother. Inside the estate, the girls became shadows of her illness. They fetched water, carried blankets, pressed cool cloths to her forehead. They sat beside her for hours, whispering stories to one another, then repeating them aloud for her sake, weaving childish tales of forests and rivers where no one was cruel, where no one whispered behind their backs. Their mother smiled faintly at these stories, her eyes glistening with both love and sorrow. She knew the world outside would never give them such kindness. At night, the house groaned with tension. The father's footsteps echoed down the hall as he stumbled to his chamber, and the girls clutched each other tighter. Sometimes they heard him muttering, his voice rising in drunken fragments. Words about demons, about the bloodline, about how the twins were the reason for every misfortune that had befallen them. Clara buried her face against Margaret's shoulder, trembling. Margaret whispered back in their secret tongue, as if her words alone could shield them. Their mother grew sicker as the months passed. She could no longer stand for long, no longer climb the stairs without gasping for breath. The doctor from town visited once, but his advice was curt. Rest, better diet, less worry. What remedy was there, after all, for a woman carrying the grief of a husband's contempt and a Valley's scorn? The twins understood, in the way children understand without words. They knew she was slipping from them, and the thought filled them with a terror sharper than the villagers' stones or the preacher's judgment. She was the only one who saw them as human, who called them blessings instead of omens. If she left them, there would be no one to stand between them and the hatred outside their walls. In the silence of her chamber, they made a promise. Clara whispered it first, her voice shaking, and Margaret echoed it in perfect unison. "We will stay together. Always." It was not only a vow of love, but of survival. If the world rejected them, they would cling to one another. If their father turned his back, they would face him as one. And if their mother left them, though they dared not say the words aloud, they would keep her memory alive by refusing to let go of each other. The estate creaked under the weight of grief and dread. The valley whispered of curses. Their father drowned himself in the bottle. And two little girls pressed their foreheads together in the dark, bound not only by birth, but by the certainty that no one else in the world would ever love them as fiercely as they loved each other. The Abernathy twins had rarely left the confines of their estate, since whispers grew into superstition. But in the summer of 1847, their mother, frail though she had become, insisted they attend Sunday service. "They are children of God," she whispered to her husband through trembling lips, "and children of God belong in his house." He muttered in reply, but did not forbid her. Perhaps even he hoped that by showing the girls at church, the rumours might soften. Or perhaps he simply no longer cared. So it was that Clara and Margaret, dressed in matching cotton dresses their mother had sewn by hand, were brought into the small clapboard church on the hill. The morning sun spilled through the windows, but inside the air turned heavy as the family crossed the threshold. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. A silence settled across the pews that no hymn could soften. The girls clung to their mother's skirts, their small hands gripping tight, their bodies moving in the mirrored rhythm that unnerved so many. They sat together in the front pew, their faces pale in the dim light, their eyes scanning the congregation. Where other children might fidget or whisper, Clara and Margaret sat still, eerily still, their posture identical, their gaze drifting in slow synchrony. To a mother, it was nervousness. To the congregation, it was proof of something unholy. The service began. The preacher's voice, steady at first, stumbled when it reached the Abernathy pew. He had baptized the girls years earlier, though reluctantly, and he had never spoken their names again in public. Now, as he read aloud the verses of sin and judgment, his voice seemed to falter on the words. Some said later that his eyes could not meet theirs. Others swore that when he glanced their way, the twins tilted their heads together at the same moment, as if mocking him. The murmurs began softly, rippling through the pews like the rustle of leaves. A woman gasped when Clara turned her head, and Margaret followed in perfect synchrony. A child cried out when the twins folded their hands in unison, their small fingers curling at the same instant. The mother tried to soothe them, stroking their hair, whispering soft words of comfort. But the damage was done. Every ordinary gesture became extraordinary in the eyes of those who had already judged them guilty. When the hymn was sung, the voices of the congregation rose. But the twins did not join in. Their lips remained still, their eyes wide, watching, always watching. Later, one man swore he heard a sound beneath the hymn, a faint hum, low and droning, that came from the Abernathy pew. Whether it was imagination or truth, the story grew taller with each retelling. By the time the sun set that day, It was said the twins had sung a different song, a devil's song, beneath the hymn of the faithful. It was during the preacher's final prayer that the worst occurred. A boy of 9, seated several pews back, fainted suddenly. His mother shrieked, clutching him as he slumped against her. The congregation erupted in chaos, whispers rising into cries. The preacher tried to restore calm, but eyes turned at once to the Abernathy sisters. Clara had been staring at the boy only moments before. Margaret's gaze had followed. To the congregation, the connection was undeniable. The twins had cursed him. The mother rose quickly, gathering her daughters in her arms, trying to shield them from the stares, from the pointing fingers, from the whispers that had sharpened into accusations. Her husband stood stiff beside her, his face drained of colour, his jaw set in stone. He did not defend them. He did not speak. He simply ushered them out, as the preacher's voice quavered in a prayer, half-spoken, half-lost. Outside, the church bells tolled as they always did, but to the valley folk that day, the sound was different. It was not a call to faith, it was a warning. By evening, the story had already spread. The boy's fainting fit became a tale of possession. The twins' silence became a chant. Their mirrored movements became mockery of the sacred order. The preacher himself, when pressed, would only mutter that some things ought not walk so freely among the faithful. He did not name the twins outright, but he did not need to. The valley had made up its mind. From that day forward, Clara and Margaret were no longer simply whispered about behind closed doors. They were marked. Wherever they went, eyes followed. Doors closed. Children were pulled away. And in the hearts of the congregation, the Abernathy twins ceased to be children at all. They had become something else, something the church itself dared not claim. Adolescence did not bring relief to Clara and Margaret Abernathy. It brought change, and with change came sharper fear. By the time they reached 12 years of age, the sisters had grown thin and pale, their bodies lengthening awkwardly, their deformities more pronounced. Their spines, once only slightly arched, bent visibly now, so that even in dresses tailored to hide their shape, their postures marked them apart. Their foreheads jutted higher, their gazes remained unfocused, never quite aligning with the eyes of those around them. To their mother, they were still. Her daughters, still precious. But to the valley, they had become living proof that the curse of their birth had not faded with time. It had ripened. Their bond had only deepened. They still walked hand in hand, their steps strangely matched, as if pulled by one rhythm. When one turned, the other followed. When one lifted her hand, the other's arm rose in eerie mimicry. To their mother, this was love, the closeness of siblings inseparable by choice and by nature. But to others, it was no longer innocent. The people whispered that the twins mirrored each other not by habit, but by some dark tether, that their movements revealed an unnatural unity of thought. And then came the illnesses. The valley was no stranger to fevers or agues. They swept through nearly every year, stealing children and weakening the old. But when a sickness claimed a young farmhand not long after the twins had passed his family's field, the whispers began again. They looked at him, his mother said, clutching her apron in grief. And days later, he was gone. The tale spread quickly, growing with each telling. By week's end, it was no longer simply a fever that had taken him. It was the Abernathy sisters. Another tragedy followed. A servant in the Abernathy house miscarried in her 7th month, a sorrow that could have happened in any home, to any family. Yet she swore, pale and trembling, that only hours before the bleeding began, the twins had whispered her name in unison. She claimed she had found them standing in the hall outside her chamber, their wide eyes fixed upon her. Whether truth or invention, the story travelled fast. It was repeated in the tavern, in the churchyard, in the fields, until it became fact in the minds of the valley. Now the twins were not merely strange, they were dangerous. Children were pulled away at the sight of them. Families crossed themselves when the sisters passed by in their carriage. The church no longer welcomed them at all, and in their own home the tension thickened. Their father, already cold, now regarded them with open suspicion. He muttered that they drained life from the house, that their presence weakened all within it. He stopped eating meals prepared in the kitchen where they lingered. He would not touch the door of the nursery. The distance between him and his daughters became a chasm that could not be crossed. The girls, now old enough to understand, withdrew further into themselves. They whispered in corners, spoke less in the presence of others, and created games only they could play. Their mother tried to keep them safe, tried to assure them of their worth, but the weight of the valley's hatred pressed harder with every passing year. Even in their innocence, they must have known that no one outside their walls would ever see them as children. Rumours twisted into legends. It was said they could sicken a man with a glance, that they had cursed livestock by walking the fence line, that their voices in the night could summon spirits. A farmer swore that when his brother lay dying, he heard two girls humming in the dist, ants though the Abernathy estate was miles away. A widow claimed she found twin handprints on her window the morning after her husband's death. These tales grew larger with each retelling until fact was swallowed whole by fear. By the time Clara and Margaret turned 13, they were no longer seen as girls, but as a force, an omen that could not be contained. Science had no words to explain them, and faith refused to claim them. They lived in the space between, a space filled by superstition, by dread, and by the whispered certainty that the Abernathy twins were not meant to walk among ordinary folk. And though they were still only children, the valley had already begun to decide how their story must end. The winter of 1849 settled over the valley like a shroud. Frost rimmed the windows of the Abernathy estate, and smoke curled thinly from the chimneys, for the fires burned low. Inside, the atmosphere was colder still, not from lack of flame, but from the slow dimming of the one light that had shielded Clara and Margaret from the world's cruelty. Their mother had been failing for months. The cough that rattled her chest grew harsher as the cold deepened, and her frame, once strong enough to carry two children at once, seemed to shrink into the bedclothes. She clung to her daughters with trembling hands, whispering prayers over them in the dark. She begged them to remember they were loved, to hold fast to each other, to never let the world make them forget they were her blessings. The girls scarcely left her side. They fetched her water with hands too small for the task. They pressed cloths to her brow, their fingers clumsy but devoted. They sang to her in their strange, humming harmony, the only lullaby they knew, and though it unnerved the servants, it seemed to bring their mother peace. For when their voices rose together, her breathing eased, and her eyes closed as if she could believe, if only for a moment, that her daughters would be safe. Her husband, by contrast, retreated deeper into his bitterness. He came to her chamber less and less until entire weeks passed without his shadow crossing her door. When he did appear, it was only to stand stiff at the foot of the bed, muttering prayers more for himself than for her. He spoke little to his daughters, and when he did, his words cut like frost. "You've drained her. You've taken everything from her." The twins did not answer. They only clutched their mother tighter, as though their silence could shield them from the poison of his voice. The end came quietly. One night, as the snow thickened outside and the house groaned beneath its weight, their mother's breathing slowed. Clara and Margaret sat on either side of her bed, their small hands pressed against hers, whispering the same words again and again. "Don't leave us, don't leave us, don't leave us." She smiled faintly, her lips parting as if to promise she never would. And then the breath slipped from H, her body, and she was gone. The twins did not scream. They did not weep in the way children were expected to. Instead, they folded into each other, their foreheads pressed together, rocking slowly as if one body holding itself upright. Their silence was louder than any cry, and it unsettled those who witnessed it. A servant fled the room in tears, muttering that no children grieved like that it was unnatural, unholy. But in truth, it was grief too deep for sound, the grief of two girls who had just lost the only person who had ever seen them as human. After the burial, the house grew emptier still. The servants began to leave, one by one, until only a few remained. Their father did nothing to stop them. He wandered the halls with a bottle in hand, his eyes bloodshot, his voice slurred. The twins, once shielded by their mother's presence, were now left to the mercy of a man who saw in them not daughters, but the embodiment of every misfortune that had befallen him. He locked them away more often now. Some days he barred them from the main rooms of the house entirely, confining them to the back chambers as though their presence poisoned the very air. Meals were left at their door, scraps of bread and cold meat. The sisters ate in silence, feeding one another when one's hands trembled too badly to hold a spoon. They grew thin, their faces pale as the moonlight that slipped through the cracks of the shutters. But they never let go of each other. At night, when the house was heavy with their father's muttering footsteps, they curled together on the narrow bed, whispering in their secret tongue. They repeated the promise they had made years before: "We will stay together, always." It was not only love, it was survival. The valley spoke of them still. Some said the death of their mother was proof of their curse, that the twins had drained the life from her as surely as they had sickened the farmhand and cursed the stillborn child. Others pitied them, if only in hushed tones, for they were children without protection, children trapped in a house that seemed to rot from within. Yet pity did not soften fear. Fear had already claimed the story, and fear gave no room for compassion. So the Abernathy twins grew into their loneliness, shaped by loss, sharpened by neglect. They had each other, and only each other, and in that bond lay both their salvation and the seed of the legend that would haunt the valley long after their names were forgotten. After their mother's death, the Abernathy house fell into a silence that was never natural. It was the silence of emptiness, of halls no longer warmed by footsteps, of windows shuttered against the world. Yet on some nights, when the wind pressed against the walls and the fire burned low, the silence broke. And those who lived near enough swore the sounds they heard did not belong to any ordinary household. It began with the singing. At first, it was only whispers among the few servants who remained. They said that late at night, long after the master of the house had collapsed into drunken sleep, the twins could be heard in their chamber. Two voices, thin and trembling, humming together in a low harmony that wound through the air like a thread. To the servants it was unnerving, too steady and too sorrowful to be mistaken for children at a play. To the valley folk, once the story spread, it became something else entirely, a chant, a conjuring, a sound meant to beckon what should not be named. Travellers who passed the Abernathy land at night began to report it as well. Some claimed they heard the voices drifting across the fields, carried on the cold air. Others swore they saw light flickering in the windows, though the family had grown too poor to keep candles burning late. In taverns, men told the tales with shaking heads, two girls singing in the dark, their voices bound so tightly together they seemed to belong to one throat. And always, the tale ended with the same warning: nothing good would come from the Abernathy bloodline. Their father heard the songs too. At first he dismissed them as dreams brought on by whiskey, but as the weeks stretched into months, his mutterings grew sharper. He began to accuse his daughters openly, his voice cracking through the halls. "You bring it into this house! You keep it alive with your voices!" He stopped eating the food left near their room, convinced it had been tainted by their touch. He barred them from the dining hall, from the parlour, from every space where his pride still lingered. In time, the twins were confined almost entirely to their chamber and the narrow hallway outside it. The house itself seemed to sag beneath the weight of neglect. Paint peeled from the walls, the shutters clattered loose, and the gardens fell into weeds. Neighbours passing at a distance remarked that the estate looked abandoned, save for the faint movement of two thin figures glimpsed in the windows, always together, always hand in hand. The image spread like wildfire, the cursed daughters haunting their own home before death had claimed them. Strange accidents only fueled the talk. A farmhand hired for work on the estate fell from the hayloft and broke his leg. He swore afterward that he had seen the twins watching him from the shadows below, their eyes fixed on him until the beam cracked beneath his foot. A maid, carrying linens, fainted in the hallway outside their room, and later claimed she had felt her chest tighten when the twins looked at her. Whether these were lies, exaggerations, or truths twisted by fear mattered little. Each became another piece of evidence in the case the valley had already judged. The girls themselves, still children though nearly grown, had no defense. They did not understand how the world had come to see them. They only knew grief and loneliness and the cruel absence of their father's love. Their songs were not spells, but laments, wordless cries for the mother who had held them through every storm. Their silence in public was not malice but fear, the fear of faces that looked at them as though they were less than human. But no one in the valley cared to ask what their songs meant. It was easier to believe they were dark than to believe they were broken. In time, the stories hardened into certainty. The Abernathy twins, once children whispered about in hushed tones, became omens spoken of openly. Men in the tavern swore they carried death in their voices. Women warned their children never to wander near the estate. And their father, pacing the halls with bloodshot eyes, muttering into the bottle, seemed to confirm it with every bitter word. "They are not mine. They were never mine. They've taken this house. They've taken everything." By the year's end, the valley no longer asked whether the twins were cursed. It asked only how long such a curse could be endured. The winter after their mother's passing was long and bitter. Snow fell thick across the valley, cutting off travel, pressing families into their homes with nothing but firelight and stories to warm them. For the Abernathys, the house grew darker still. Their father drank heavily, often gone for days, returning only to mutter threats at his daughters before retreating into his chamber. The few servants who remained walked softly, their eyes lowered, as if afraid of what might happen if they looked too long at the twins. Into this tense silence came the new farmhand, a broad-shouldered man named Samuel Bryce. He was young, reckless, and brimming with the bravado of someone who had yet to learn when to keep his tongue. He had heard the stories, of course, everyone in the valley had, but he dismissed them as nonsense. To him, the Abernathy twins were not curses or omens. They were freaks, and freaks, he believed, deserved no respect. The incident began on a cold evening when the sisters wandered briefly from their chamber into the hallway, their bare feet padding softly on the wooden floor. They carried a candle between them, their faces pale in its light. Samuel saw them as he carried firewood through the corridor. He stopped, grinned cruelly, and muttered words meant to wound. "Two shadows walking where one should be," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Should have smothered you both the night you came out." The twins froze. Clara's hand tightened around Margaret's, their fingers interlaced until the knuckles whitened. Neither spoke. Their silence, their stillness, unsettled even Samuel for a moment. But arrogance won out, and he stepped closer, lowering his voice to a hiss. "You hear me? You're not right. Everyone knows it. You don't belong here, or anywhere." Their eyes lifted together, slowly, unnervingly. For a moment, Samuel felt his chest tighten, as though the air had grown heavy around him. He shook it off, spat on the floor, and stormed away, muttering curses as he went. That night, as the house slept, Samuel collapsed in the servants' quarters. His body convulsed, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth, his limbs jerking wildly. By dawn, he was dead. The doctor who examined him could find no explanation beyond A fit of the brain. Epilepsy, perhaps. Bad spirits, others said. But in the valley, the conclusion was instant, inevitable. They looked at him, one servant whispered, her voice trembling. They didn't say a word, and hours later he was gone. The tale spread by noon. By evening, it was gospel. Samuel Bryce had mocked the twins, and the twins had struck him down. No one asked whether he had been ill before. No one considered the possibility of accident. In a valley ruled by superstition, coincidence was a luxury no one afforded. Fear filled the gaps where reason might have lived. From that day forward, the Abernathy twins were not simply strange, not merely cursed. They were killers in the eyes of the people. No one dared enter the estate unless forced by duty or poverty. Children crossed themselves at the mention of their names. Farmers whispered that their stares could rot the crops, that their humming voices could call death into a house. The story grew taller with each telling, until the twins became less than human and more than human at once, creatures neither science nor faith would claim. Their father, hearing the rumours, did not defend them. He fed them instead, feeding the story with his own bitterness. He raged that his daughters had brought ruin upon him, that they had cursed his home, that everything he had lost was their fault. He told neighbours he would be better off if they were gone, and though he spoke in drunken anger, his words carried weight. For if a man's own father would call them demons, who was left to argue they were not? In their chamber, Clara and Margaret pressed close, listening to the house creak under the burden of their father's wrath and the valley's hatred. They were still only children, though their bodies had grown into awkward adolescence. They did not understand why the world saw them as monsters. They only knew they were alone, and that their vow to each other, "We will stay together, always," was now the only anchor left to them. The valley had decided their fate. The question was no longer whether the Abernathy twins were cursed, but how long the community could endure them before deciding to act. By the year 1850, the Abernathy estate no longer resembled a home. Its walls sagged with neglect, shutters clattered loose in the wind, and the gardens lay overrun with weeds and thorns. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and stale drink. The master of the house, once a man of stature, had become little more than a ghost, pacing the halls with a bottle in hand, muttering words no one dared challenge. His paranoia had grown steadily since the death of Samuel Bryce. He avoided his daughters entirely now, refusing even to look at them when they passed. When servants delivered food to the girls' chamber, he demanded it be set down with tongs, as though their touch might poison the dishes. "They drain the house," he muttered. "They feed on it. On me. On all of us." At night, he roamed the corridors, his footsteps heavy, his voice rising in drunken fragments. "They've taken her. They'll take me too. They won't stop until there's nothing left." The twins, shut away in their room, heard every word. Clara pressed her hands to her ears. Margaret wrapped her arms around her sister and whispered their promise again. "We will stay together, always." Yet even together they could not block out the venom of their father's voice. In town, his decline became the subject of cruel amusement. Once a man of wealth and standing, he now appeared ragged, his coat unbuttoned, his eyes bloodshot. He staggered into the tavern demanding whiskey, ranting about curses and demons, about daughters who were not his own. Some pitied him, others laughed, but all agreed on one point. The twins were destroying him. The story needed no evidence. His withered frame and trembling hands were proof enough. Then, one winter night, he shed. The servants awoke to silence where there should have been his stumbling tread. His chamber door stood open, the sheets tangled as if he had risen in haste. His boots were gone, though the ground outside showed no tracks in the fresh snow. The bottle he had carried to bed lay shattered on the floor, its contents staining the boards like blood. Searches were mounted at first, Men from the valley scoured the woods, the riverbanks, the frozen fields. They found nothing. Not a shred of clothing, not a footprint, not a bone. After days of searching, the effort dwindled. By week's end, the valley reached its conclusion. The twins had taken him. No one could agree on how. Some swore they had sung him into madness, leading him into the woods where no man could return. Others whispered they had drained the life from him in his sleep, leaving nothing but air where his body had been. A few claimed he had fled in shame, unwilling to live another day beneath the weight of their curse. But the majority spoke only one truth, repeated until it became a certainty: he had not left by choice. The twins had made him vanish. For Clara and Margaret, the disappearance meant only deeper isolation. With their father gone, the few remaining servants fled as well, unwilling to remain in a house now wholly under the twins' shadow. By spring, the estate stood nearly empty, save for the two sisters themselves. The house creaked with their footsteps and echoed with their voices. A hollow shell inhabited by children, the valley no longer dared approach. From that day forward, the Abernathy twins were orphans in every sense. They had no mother, no father, no servants, no protectors. They lived only by the scraps of food delivered to their door by neighbours who left offerings at the edge of the property, too afraid to cross the threshold. They cooked for themselves in cold hearths, wore dresses that grew threadbare with each passing season, and wandered the empty halls like shadows. And yet, the valley still spoke of them. The absence of their father became proof of their power. His name was forgotten quickly. Theirs grew darker with every telling. They were no longer girls. They were curses in flesh. And their story was no longer whispered in fear alone. It was told with the thrill of terror, as one might speak of ghosts or demons. The Abernathy estate, once a place of wealth, had become a legend in itself. The house where two sisters lived without age, without parents, without mercy. And though the valley kept its distance, all knew that the twins remained inside, hand in hand, waiting. By the early 1850s, the Abernathy estate had taken on the look of ruin. Vines crawled up its walls, shutters clung by rusted hinges, and the iron gates sagged on broken posts. Travellers who passed at a distance said it looked less like a home than a mausoleum, a place where life had long since drained away. Yet now and then, a glimpse betrayed the truth. Two figures, thin and pale, moving through the windows. Always two. Woe, never one. Always side by side. Clara and Margaret had grown taller but not stronger. Their frames were narrow, their shoulders hunched, their deformities more pronounced with age. Their eyes, still strangely misaligned, gave them the appearance of looking past whoever tried to meet their gaze. They dressed in garments patched again and again, the once fine fabric reduced to faded cloth. And though they were teenagers now, they clung to each other as tightly as when they were children, hands never parting, steps never out of rhythm. They rarely left the estate. Hunger drove them to wander the fields sometimes, searching for berries or roots. But even then they stayed close to the house, avoiding the valley roads. Yet despite their seclusion, stories about them spread more wildly than ever. For in their absence, imagination did what fact could not. It turned two orphaned girls into spectres. Neighbours swore they saw them walking at dusk, their outlines shimmering in the mist, their voices humming through the twilight air. A farmer's wife claimed she woke one night to see two pale faces peering through her window, though no footprints marked the frosted ground outside. A child insisted she heard laughter in the woods, not the laughter of girls, but the hollow echo of something older, colder, wearing the sound of youth as a mask. Each sighting, each rumour, grew taller as it was told. By the time it reached the tavern, the twins were no longer merely wandering their land. They were said to glide over the fields, to vanish into thin air, to walk through locked doors. No one dared approach the estate to test the tales. Fear had built a wall higher than any stone. For the twins themselves, life was nothing like the legends. It was hunger, loneliness, and the endless company of only each other. They cooked what little food they could, huddled together against the cold, and whispered stories in their secret language to pass the endless nights. They did not know that their silence outside their home was taken as proof of sorcery. They did not know that their humming voices, meant only to comfort each other, had become omens of death in the mouths of neighbors. They only knew that they were alone, and that the world hated them without reason. Still, the valley's certainty hardened. When crops failed, it was because the twins walked too near the fields. When a child sickened, it was because the twins' shadows had fallen on the house. When an ox stumbled and broke its leg, it was because the twins' eyes had lingered too long. Evidence was no longer necessary. The Abernathy sisters had become a story, and stories demand belief. Children dared one another to sneak close to the estate, but none stayed long. They returned pale and breathless, swearing they had heard humming from the walls or seen two faces staring from the upstairs window. These tales, repeated in whispers, ensured that no one ever truly forgot the sisters. They lived in isolation, yet their presence was everywhere. In the prayers of the faithful, in the curses muttered during bad harvests, in the shivers that ran down spines when the night grew too quiet. Clara and Margaret were not simply shunned anymore. They were myth while still alive, the creatures that blurred the line between flesh and spirit. In the valley's mind, they were no longer girls with crooked spines and wandering eyes. They were omens, living proof that nature itself could go astray. And so, as the years crept on, the Abernathy twins grew into shadows within their own lifetime. They were feared, pitied, hated, and retold. But above all, they were remembered. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest fate of all. The year 1854 brought with it a cruel summer. The valley sweltered beneath a relentless sun, crops withered, and tempers grew sharp. Hunger stalked the land, and in times of want, superstition always found fresh fuel. Whispers of the Abernathy twins flared again. Farmers claimed the drought had come because the sisters walked the fields at dusk. Mothers warned their children that if they wandered too near the estate, the twins would steal the very breath from their lungs. Inside the decaying house, Clara and Margaret had grown thinner still. Their faces were hollow, their shoulders bowed, their once soft hair turned brittle with neglect. Yet still they clung to each other, moving as though bound by invisible threads. They cooked what little food they could find, shared every crumb, and whispered their secret language late into the night. To them, the world had long ceased to exist beyond their bond. It was Margaret who fell ill first. The sickness came suddenly, a fever that burned her thin frame, a weakness that left her trembling and unable to rise from bed. Clara sat beside her, refusing to leave her side, pressing cool cloths to her forehead, whispering comforts in their strange harmony. Neighbors later claimed they heard two voices chanting through the night, though in truth it was Clara alone, humming desperately to soothe her sister. But the fever did not break. Margaret's eyes grew dim, her breathing shallow, her small hand gripping Clara's as though it were the only thing holding her in the world. For days, Clara would not sleep, her own health faltering as she tended to her sister. And then, one morning, the hand in hers went limp. Margaret's chest stilled, her head fell against the pillow, her gaze fixed on nothing. Clara did not cry out. She did not move. She only pressed her forehead against her sister's still one, whispering over and over, "We will stay together. Always." Hours passed. Servants, what few remained, said they found her there, rocking gently, her lips moving in ceaseless repetition. They begged her to leave the room, to eat, to rest. She would not. She clung to Margaret's body, her eyes wild, her voice breaking with the same vow she had spoken since childhood. By the next dawn, Clara could no longer stand. Her body weakened, her breath shallow, her skin clammy with sweat. It was as though the fever that had claimed her sister had passed into her by touch alone. She lay down beside Margaret, clasped her sister's cold hand, and whispered one final time, "Always." Before the sun rose, she too was gone. The valley seized upon the story instantly. To some, it was proof of the unnatural tether between the twins, a bond that could not be broken even by death. To others it was punishment, God reclaiming what should never have existed in the first place. The preacher declared it an act of divine judgment, though his voice trembled as he spoke. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves on the estate, their names left off the church rolls, their memory preserved only in whispers. But the burial did not end their story. If anything, it gave it sharper teeth. Neighbors claimed they still saw them, walking hand in hand through the fields at dusk. Children swore they heard humming on the wind, two voices joined in eerie harmony. Farmers whispered that their crops failed on nights when the sound grew strongest, and travellers, passing the abandoned estate, spoke of two pale figures staring from the upper windows, their faces pressed together, their eyes fixed on the road as though watching for someone who would never come. The valley could not explain what it had witnessed. Science had no words for their mirrored deformities, their uncanny bond, their simultaneous decline. Faith refused to claim them, declaring them unnatural, and so the story remained in the shadows, passed from mouth to ear, generation after generation. The tale of Clara and Margaret Abernathy, the sisters who could not live apart, and who refused to die alone. The summer heat lingered long after Clara and Margaret were laid to rest, and with it, the valley's unease grew heavier still. Their graves were dug on the Abernathy land, shallow plots without markers, as though even in death the sisters were to be denied the dignity of names. The preacher would not preside over the burial. Instead, two men from the village lowered the bodies into the earth, while a handful of servants stood silent, eyes fixed on the ground. There were no hymns, no prayers, only the sound of shovels striking dirt, covering the sisters as though erasing them would be easier than remembering. But memory has never been so simple. In the days that followed, the valley expected relief. With the twins gone, misfortune should have lifted. The land should have softened, the air grown lighter, the fear dissolved into ordinary days. Instead, the silence of their absence bred new fears. If they were dead, why did the stories not end? A farmer walking the ridge one evening swore he saw two figures in the distance, pale against the setting sun, hand in hand. He thought at first they were living children, until he realized no sound of footsteps reached him across the dry earth. The figures lingered a moment longer, then vanished into the haze. By morning, the tale had spread. The Abernathy twins had not left the valley. Others soon added their voices. A widow claimed she awoke to humming outside her window, low and droning, like a lullaby sung by unseen mouths. When she opened the shutters, there was nothing, yet the sound lingered in her ears until dawn. Children whispered that they had seen two faces in the glass of the abandoned estate, staring down at them with blank eyes. Some said the faces pressed together, so close they seemed carved from the same shadow. The valley turned each sighting into a story, and each story into proof. The sisters, they said, had not truly died. Death had no hold on them. They walked the land still, bound together as they always had been, haunting the very soil that had rejected them. Parents warned their children to keep away from the Abernathy fields. Travellers quickened their pace when passing the sagging gates. And in the taverns, men swore that if one listened closely on still nights, one could hear the twins humming, just as they had in life, their voices rising from the earth itself. Even the land seemed touched by their absence. The estate rotted faster than any building its age should have. Roof tiles fell with each storm, windows cracked without cause, vines strangled the walls. It became a place of dares, where the bravest boys crept at dusk to prove their courage. None stayed long. They returned pale, shaken, insisting they had felt eyes on them or heard laughter echoing from the upper rooms. Some claimed they had seen twin shadows on the stairwell, frozen in place until they fled. The preacher, pressed again for words, declared that such tales were foolishness, that the sisters were gone, and their memory ought to be buried with them. But even as he spoke, his eyes betrayed unease, for he too had heard the rumours, and in his heart he could not dismiss them. No man of God had ever felt easy naming the Abernathy girls, alive or dead. The years passed, and the valley changed. Families moved, children grew, harvests rose and fell. But the story never faded. It clung to the land like a stain, retold by each generation with slight variations, but always with the same core. Two sisters, cursed and inseparable, haunting the place that had despised them. They became not merely a memory but a warning, invoked to frighten children into obedience. Stay close after dark, or the Abernathy twins will find you. Don't wander near the river, or you'll hear their song. The twins had lived and died as outcasts, yet in death they achieved what life had denied them: permanence. They became part of the valley's bones, their names carved not into stone, but into the whispers of those who never forgot. And so, though the dirt had covered their bodies, Clara and Margaret Abernathy remained, not as daughters, not as children, but as legends. Legends that walked the line between fear and sorrow, never allowed to rest. Decades passed, and the valley changed. New families settled the land, the old tavern was rebuilt after a fire, and the church grew larger, its walls painted over so many times that the past seemed almost scrubbed away. Yet the story of Clara and Margaret Abernathy did not fade. It lingered in doorways and hearthside whispers, in the minds of children who dared each other to approach the estate, in the silence of parents who could not explain misfortune without invoking their names. The estate itself fell into ruin. By the 1870s, the roof had caved, the walls sagged inward, and weeds claimed the stone steps. Travellers passing by saw only a hollow shell of a house, yet they swore it still bore a presence, as if the shadows behind its shattered windows had shape and intent. Some insisted they had seen movement within, two figures slipping across the frame of an upstairs room, their forms so alike they could only belong to the sisters. In time, men of learning came to the valley. Doctors, natural philosophers, and early students of the strange new field of psychology. They heard the tales of the Abernathy twins and searched for explanations. Perhaps, they said, the sisters had suffered from congenital deformities, hydrocephalus, scoliosis, strabismus, conditions poorly understood in their day. Their mirrored afflictions, so unsettling to their neighbours, might have been the simple consequence of shared blood. Their mirrored movements, their eerie synchronicity, could have been habit, the result of children who had never been apart. Even their deaths, one following the other, might be explained by shock, grief, or some condition of the heart. The valley listened, nodded, and dismissed it. Science had no weight against fear that had lived for generations. A doctor's diagnosis could not erase the songs people swore they heard on still nights, nor could it explain the shadows seen by travellers on the ridge. To the valley, the Abernathy sisters were not a case study. They were an omen. Faith, too, offered no refuge. The church records bore no trace of their names, as if the preacher had scrubbed them from the rolls. Sermons never spoke of them, though warnings against pride and sin grew sharper in the years after their deaths. It was as though the church itself had chosen to bury them, not only in earth but in silence, refusing to acknowledge what did not fit into Scripture. And yet, in refusing, it ensured their legend endured, for the things left unspoken often outlived the things proclaimed. As the century turned, the Abernathy twins were no longer remembered as children at all. They had become something larger, something more enduring than flesh. They were invoked in stories told to frighten children into obedience, to explain sickness or accident, to give shape to misfortune. And though each generation forgot the details, the year of their birth, the illness that took their mother, the father who vanished without trace, the core remained the same. Two sisters, inseparable in life, inseparable in death, bound by a bond that frightened all who saw it. Even now, the land remembers. On certain nights, when the air lies still and the moon hangs low, those who pass the ruins of the Abernathy estate speak of a sound faint as breath, two voices humming in perfect unison. Some say they see pale figures walking the fields, hand in hand, faces turned toward one another as though sharing a secret that will never be spoken aloud. Whether illusion, imagination, or something more, the effect is the same: fear, sorrow, wonder. The tragedy of Clara and Margaret Abernathy was never in their birth. It was in their rejection. Born as daughters, they were denied that name. Born as children, they were denied innocence. Born as human, they were cast as monsters. The world around them, too narrow to explain what it did not understand, chose to bury them not only in earth but in rumour. And yet in doing so it gave them immortality. For legends endure where lives cannot, and the legend of the Abernathy twins remains, not written in history books, not preserved in church records, but carried in the whispers of those who still speak their names when the night grows too quiet. Clara and Margaret Abernathy. Two sisters, one soul, a bloodline science could not contain. You've just heard the forbidden story of Clara and Margaret Abernathy, twin sisters whose lives were shaped by fear and whose deaths only deepened their legend. But what do you believe? Were they simply children misunderstood by a cruel world, or something that defied nature itself? I want to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and tell me what you think. And tell me, too, where in the world you're listening from tonight. Your voice joins theirs, and together we keep these shadows alive. If you haven't already, subscribe to the Macabre Record so you never miss the next tale that history tried to bury. Until then, remember, some stories never rest.